Before the release of The Last of Us Part 2, actor Troy Baker said this of the game: "I don't know whether people are going to like it, or if they're going to hate it, but they definitely will not be ambivalent about it." Now, after the game's release, after playing it and digesting it for a couple weeks, I have to say I'm kind of ambivalent about it. This game has been the subject of controversy ever since substantial plot points were leaked prior to launch. It's continued to be the subject of debate, outrage, and some abysmal behavior. Maybe because it's 2020 and I'm just so very tired of everything, or maybe because I was resigned to this game being disappointing on some level no matter what, but I just don't think it's worth getting all that worked up about. And that's coming from someone who really loves the first game. Like most discussions in our society right now, the one surrounding this game has been polarizing, with the loudest voices either being extremely positive or extremely negative. I feel terrible for the people behind this game who are getting so much hate, especially the writers and the actors. I shouldn't have to say this, but I feel like I need to. It's not okay to make personal attacks toward people because the fiction they produced wasn't to your liking. If you think Neil Druckmann is a bad writer or had some inartful responses to criticism, that's fine. But we as a culture need to stop dehumanizing people and giving in to mob mentality. I don't think Neil Druckmann or his fellow lead writer Hallie Gross are terrible writers or terrible people, but I do have some problems with the game. It's obviously a beautiful work of art in many ways. As a technical showpiece, a swan song for the PlayStation 4, it is incredible to behold. The characters, the animation, the environment design, the music, the bespoke nature of so many of its assets. It's the very definition of a big-budget, lavishly produced single-player game. I'm always glad to see those are still getting made, although the human cost behind it is distressing. A Last of Us sequel was always going to be disappointing to some segment of the audience. A continuation of Joel and Ellie's story would inevitably shatter the open-ended nature of the first game's ending. A sequel was likely to be maligned for being too safe, too similar to its predecessor, and thus failing to justify its existence. Or it would be too risky, alienating a portion of the fan base who didn't get more of what they loved about the original. That second option is basically what happened. The Last of Us Part 2 has been heralded by some as a bold masterpiece, setting a new standard for this type of story-heavy, character-focused game. Certainly in terms of story choices, it's bold. In terms of narrative structure, it's wildly different from Part 1. But in terms of gameplay, I don't think Naughty Dog took many risks at all. Do you know why this game is a revenge story? It's not because that was the most interesting narrative choice. Revenge stories, especially in video games, are all too common. If this were a novel or a TV series, a continuation could have had a different focus. What if this was primarily about the drama of Ellie finding out the truth about what Joel did? What if the whole town found out? Would they treat him differently? What if Tommy, as a former Firefly, had a hostile reaction when Joel told him the story? What if Abby's group showed up in Jackson and demanded justice instead of carrying it out vigilante style? Does Joel's death at the hands of former Fireflies make sense narratively? For sure. But was that inevitable in the story? Not at all. There are all kinds of ways that this stuff could have been handled, but a revenge story, a story about violence and suffering and killing, that dovetails nicely into a game where those are the foremost game mechanics. This isn't an adventure game where the primary activity is navigating dialogue trees and making choices. This is a stealth action survival game where you slit people's throats and listen to them gurgle in their own blood as they die. So while many of this game's narrative choices are interesting and bold, the general direction of the story was dictated by the gameplay. It's a revenge story to provide a scenario for the new and improved murder sim. And because the needs of the gameplay dictate the story, it can never truly be character-driven. It has to provide a context for the gameplay, and the gameplay, apparently, has to build upon the foundation previously established. You can't tell a story about Joel and Ellie where violence isn't central, even if that would be more appropriate, even if it would be more interesting or true to the characters. I wonder if there's an alternate reality out there where we're praising this game for how boldly it changed its game mechanics to fit the story, instead of telling yet another violent revenge tale. Part of the issue is the realistic tone of The Last of Us. While there's still plenty of video game contrivance, the games as presented are meant to be taken seriously. This isn't Uncharted. Nathan Drake is more of an action movie hero than a serious, deep character. The fact that Nathan Drake keeps having wild adventures game after game is not a problem, because Uncharted isn't asking us to take things all that seriously. But the characters of The Last of Us are meant to be closer to real people, emotionally if nothing else. Repeatedly putting them in extreme situations strains that credibility and relatability over time. After a certain point, the amount of trauma, violence, and general peril a character experiences eclipses believability. And that's one of the reasons I'd hoped The Last of Us would be more of an anthology series. I didn't seriously think there would never be another Last of Us game. Naughty Dog didn't spend all the time, effort, and money on the first game, only to never pick up the IP again. But I had hoped when they did, a second game would tell the story of different characters. Naughty Dog is a wildly popular and celebrated developer, and I don't think they needed the crutch of returning characters for their game to draw attention and sales. Those are my personal issues with the premise, but I generally ascribe to the notion that execution matters far more than concept. So let's talk about what we actually got with The Last of Us Part 2. One of the game's two boldest choices was to kill Joel, and kill him very early in the game. For me, this wasn't a huge surprise. Even from the first reveal trailer, there was speculation that Joel was in fact dead, and the plot of the game would revolve around Ellie going after his killers. Joel's appearance in that trailer was just a red herring. What else would motivate Ellie and the player to the kind of vengeful rage she expresses there? It had to be Joel. Of course, this turned out to be exactly the case. From a narrative perspective, it made sense to kill Joel. There weren't many natural directions to take the character in a sequel. By the end of The Last of Us, we have a pretty good idea of who Joel is and what makes him tick. We understand, and maybe even empathize with his choice to save Ellie over the potential cure. His character arc was finished. Having a character hang around when there's nothing for them to do just because they're beloved isn't a great choice creatively. Killing Joel was a pretty sensible move from a creative perspective. I can understand on a pure, visceral level why many fans didn't like this. They love Joel as a character. I love Joel as a character. I'm very attached to Troy Baker's performance and his chemistry with Ashley Johnson as Ellie. The scenes they share are still some of the best in Part 2. Joel's death is deliberately very upsetting. It's meant to make you feel sick and angry, not just for Ellie's sake, but because you have a personal attachment to him. The scene is very effective at that. That's exactly how I felt when I saw it the first time. After watching it, I wasn't even sure I wanted to continue. But I think many players took the feelings this scene produced, and they turned that ire onto the game itself, rather than giving it a fair shake. We saw the same kind of thing with Star Wars The Last Jedi's handling of Luke Skywalker. Luke changed a lot between the old movies and the new ones, but Joel is pretty much the same guy in Part 2. There's not this moment when the story recasts him in a drastically different light, changes his motivations, or his personality. There's no character assassination here, or anything close to that. I think some fans forget that Joel was not an especially good person. While he wasn't malevolent or sadistic, he had no compunction about using violence as a tool for survival. He does a lot of horrific things in the course of the first game, but the reason much of the audience still likes the character, myself included, is because we understand his point of view. We know what he's lost. We know that beneath the hardened exterior is a grieving father who's been forced to do terrible things to survive. Both his violent past and his more admirable traits are acknowledged and shown in Part 2. That's what's compelling about Joel as a character. He has the great capacity for kindness, thoughtfulness, love. And yet his love is often driven by selfishness and protected by lies or violence, or both. That tension between the capacity and desire for good and evil is very human. Part 2 does a great job at showing that. The game does right by Joel, even though it kills him off. Although the majority of critics lauded this game with praise, a significant handful of prominent sites posted negative reviews. Some of the main criticisms were that the game had little to actually say about revenge or hate, despite wallowing in graphic violence and misery. I think these criticisms have validity, but I have mixed feelings about the violence in this game. Based on those reviews, I was worried that the story would be unrelentingly bleak, with few moments of levity or charm. That's not the case. There are definitely a lot of humanizing moments, But for every time you play fetch with an adorably rendered dog, there are 5 you brutally put down in combat. Every scene of joy and life affirmation is balanced out by 3 of pain and misery. Of course the game is violent. It's a post-apocalyptic revenge tale and a sequel to an already brutal, violent game. Thanks to the technological leap between 2013 and 2020, the violence is more detailed here. The way you inflict bodily harm is quite vivid. The sound effects and voice acting are meant to make you squirm. Aside from the visceral gameplay, there are a number of cutscenes and scripted sequences that put the violence right in your face. But the most significant change between the first and second game's use of violence isn't the technology, it's context. In The Last of Us, fights were brutal and hard-hitting, but when you kill humans in that game, it's almost always in the name of survival. Most of the human enemies you come across are cast as bandits, killers, or cannibals, people you're not supposed to feel all that bad about. And your overall goal of getting Ellie to the Fireflies is presented as a noble one. Violence in Part 1 was largely utilitarian. In Part 2, it takes on a more sadistic edge. Rather than survival, the context is now revenge, and that gives a very different flavor to the violence. In some ways, I actually appreciate the graphic nature of the gameplay. Games tend to make killing a quicker, cleaner, less impactful act than it really is. Taking life as routine in games. It's something that players don't think twice about unless they're given an explicit reason for doing so. It's hard to ignore the violence in Part 2, and that's what Naughty Dog was going for. In being so graphic, the violence is more honest, and yet this is meant to be the fun part of the game. I'd argue that the level of violence often goes beyond what's necessary to make a point, and into the realm of gratuity. Like, is it really necessary to show this level of violence against children? Did the Seraphites really need to eviscerate people? How many brutal murders do we really need to be witness to or participants in? As the game went on, I wished more and more for non-lethal combat options. I understand why that wouldn't have fit the game, but equally, I understand some players' objection to playing a game that continually forces you to do things you're meant to feel bad about. Is it a lesson for the player or for the character? The level and frequency of violence serves to dull its effect by the end of the game. The brutal final brawl between Ellie and Abby would have been even more powerful if this weren't the case, but there were times when I just had to laugh at the level of violence on display. According to Neil Druckmann, the first game's theme, in one word, was love. It was a story about the connections between individual people. What happens when those connections are challenged or severed? Druckmann said the second game's theme is hate, but I think much more than hate, violence, or trauma, the theme which the game best explores is perspective. That brings us to the game's second bold choice, dual protagonists. It's not Ellie and Joel as fans had hoped, it's not Ellie and Dina as you might have guessed from pre-release coverage. It's Ellie and Abby. Abby, the woman who murders Joel in cold blood 2 hours into the story. You can't say they didn't take a risk doing that. The entire game hinges on this decision, and it dramatically affected the pacing, focus, and narrative cohesion. Nearly equal time is given to Abby and Ellie, and that time is divvied up kind of strangely. You spend almost the length of the entire first game playing as Ellie, thinking hers is the story being told. But then, at the climactic encounter with Abby, you switch perspectives, and it's not just a flashback explaining her motivation to kill Joel, it's a whole additional campaign. You repeat the past 3 days from Abby's perspective. This is a surprise, but I don't think it was just for shock value. The game is asking you to play as the character cast in the villain role up to that point, and it's not a fun villain. It's not a fun role reversal. Abby is a character the player likely hates at this point. One of the game's chief triumphs was that it got me to empathize with Abby. By the end of the game, I was much more in her corner than Ellie's. Abby starts obsessed with vengeance, but ends as somebody who just wants to live in peace with her people. She grew tired of fighting and killing and conflict, so did I. But I'm not sure I agree with the decision to make half the game about Abby, or with how the game is ultimately structured. Because you play Abby's chunk of the game second, it was more in my mind towards the end of the game, but the end of the game shifts back to Ellie's perspective primarily. The ending of the game is about Ellie, but there's a 10-hour interruption between the main part of Ellie's story and its final act. The game is more than a little convoluted with all the shifting perspectives, flashbacks, and flashbacks within flashbacks. I don't know if players would have accepted switching back and forth between Ellie and Abby during the Seattle portion of the game, but I wonder if that would have worked better. What I can say for certain is that the way things play out lessened my ability to be with the characters emotionally. There are two reasons for that. One is that they're asking the player, presumably, to empathize with both Ellie and Abby, characters that often have opposing goals and drastically different viewpoints. When our viewpoint is limited to that of our main character, we identify with them more easily and more intimately. Following multiple opposed characters takes the audience from an intimate partisan viewpoint to a more omniscient neutral one. Aligning player and character motivation is more important in video games than other media, because in a game you're controlling the character's actions. You're playing some part in propelling the story forward. So if you think the characters are making terrible, awful decisions, and the game is just expecting you to carry those out because that's how the story goes, well, there's a disconnect there. You can have a game where the player character makes bad decisions as part of the story, but that's not at all the same thing as watching a character make their own decisions in passive media. A great example of this was at the end of Abby's main section. After 3 in-game days, you finally get back to that climactic confrontation between our two leads. Finally, it's time to see what happens in the standoff between Ellie and Abby. It's a boss fight. This is where the game really lost me. I just didn't want to do it. At that point, I identified with both characters. I wanted to see the resolution of their story, but I didn't want to play out a fight between them, and I especially didn't want it to be treated as a video game boss fight. It really took me out of the moment. The other issue preventing me from identifying with the characters emotionally was that the story being told was largely internal. The real meat of the narrative is what goes on under the surface. It's not the scenes, it's not the plot, it's what those scenes and plot points mean for the characters. Ellie's arc is particularly hard to follow. She's not very forthcoming about her feelings or internal struggles, so you have to read between the lines. And that's totally fine. Subtle storytelling is preferred in serious adult drama. The problem is the signal-to-noise ratio. There's so much stuff in this game that doesn't contribute to the real story. The zombies in this zombie apocalypse game feel more superfluous than ever. And even worse, there's some vital context for how these characters act and feel that doesn't get shared until late in the game, by which time it's possible that many players have already checked out. For Ellie, the story is just as much about dealing with the truth of what Joel did as it is about her reaction to his murder. I was surprised by just how central the Joel-Ellie relationship still was in this game. So much of the story is about dealing with the ending of the last one. That makes a lot of sense, but it's not something that's furthered by the stealth action gameplay. The Last of Us Part 1 worked so well because of its relative simplicity. The bulk of that game was about Joel softening toward Ellie and eventually embracing his paternal instincts, despite his past trauma. Ellie was your near-constant companion, and just by virtue of the two spending so much time together, the gameplay regularly contributed to furthering that story. In Part 2, Ellie spends a significant amount of time by herself. Dina and Jesse pop in and out of the story, but she never opens up to either of them. Because of this, much of the story has to be told in flashback. I did enjoy the flashbacks. They're a welcome change of pace and scenery. It was wonderful to see our principal characters in a different light, but I think some of the choices about what and when to reveal information are questionable. The player spends much of the game believing Ellie doesn't know the truth about Joel. We're led to believe that Tommy is the only person in Jackson who knows, and since Joel's dead, he's going to have to be the one to tell Ellie because she has to find out, right? We find out much later that Ellie's known the truth for some time. Her quest for revenge has not happened in ignorance, but in full knowledge of what Joel did, and that context is extremely significant. This is presented as a shocking twist, and it is, but I think that might have been a mistake. This happens in the lead up to the climactic encounter between Ellie and Abby. That's what we're focused on, not trying to process Ellie's mental state. And after that climactic scene, we switch to Abby for the next 10 hours or so. If this information had been presented earlier, before Joel's death, we would have been able to understand Ellie's position better. Unfortunately, Ellie is constantly treated as a cipher. a sort of emotional puzzle to be teased out over the course of the game, instead of a character we can identify with in the moment. That puts a distance between player and protagonist that didn't exist in the first game, at least not until the very end. There's a lot to like in Abby's section of the game, but overall, it's much weaker than Ellie's. That's mainly because it's so tangential to the central story. Only part of Abby's playthrough focuses on her friends, the friends we've just hunted down and killed as Ellie. Those parts are effective and contribute well to the main themes of the game. There are a lot of obvious parallels between Ellie and Abby's stories that exist to humanize Abby. The death of a father figure, a relatively safe and established home base, a loyal group of friends, animal companions, a love triangle, a pregnancy, a whimsical trip to a museum. While having so many direct parallels is a little obvious, at least it contributes to the story. Large swaths of Abby's playthrough are about things that don't seem to have much bearing on the real story. We find out more about the wolves and their war with the Seraphites. There's a whole subplot with Owen that doesn't really go anywhere, and then there's Lev and Yara, two Seraphite kids who Abby goes far out of her way to help, as sort of a penance for her guilt over killing Joel. I like the idea that Abby's weighed down by guilt, that over time she's becoming disillusioned with violence and killing. She's coming to realize that her vengeance hasn't brought her the inner peace she was looking for. And though killing Joel might have been justified, it ultimately left her empty and still broken. Abby is ahead of Ellie on that emotional journey. I don't hate Abby, and I don't resent the idea of her being a secondary protagonist, but it was during her segment that the game really lost me. I really hate the Seraphites. They come off as a generic, evil religious cult. Nothing about them was the least bit compelling to me. After the game did so much to humanize Abby and her companions, it seemed lazy and antithetical to show an entire faction of horrible, nonsensical people. Abby's Seattle Day 3 chapter is the worst part of the entire game. The backdrop is a full-scale conflict between the WLF and Seraphites. I just couldn't care less about that. It also strains believability to have our characters running around in a war zone where both sides want them dead. You're on the Seraphite island to rescue Lev, who's gone to try and save his zealous religious mother. After far too much combat, you finally get to Lev and Yara's home, only to find that Lev has had to kill his mother in self-defense, which is just a horrible, sickening concept that's almost comically dark at this point. But there's no time to let that plot point breathe, because you're still in the middle of a war zone. On your way out, you encounter the wolf leader, who threatens Abby, then gets shot by Yara, who is then shot by the soldiers. It all happens so fast, and none of it lands. The pacing and staging of these scenes make the events feel meaningless. For a final encore, right before you leave the Seraphite Island, you have a boss fight with a big guy who just won't die. It's brutal. It's ugly. It's at this point I became convinced that the people who made this game are sadists. This isn't some kind of villain who's been built up for hours. It's just some guy. Why is this here? Why is this so graphic? What purpose does it serve? Directly after this is the fight with Ellie that I mentioned earlier, and that was truly the low point of the game for me. Aside from Joel's death, the biggest critique from many fans is the game's ending, specifically that Ellie spares Abby in the end. I have some bones to pick with the ending, but that is not one of them. The ending was one of the strongest parts of the original game. It left us profoundly impacted by what we'd experienced. It meant something. If the point of Part 2's ending was to leave us as empty and sad as the characters in the story, mission accomplished. But I think it's all right for me to say that I don't much care to be left in that state, especially right now. There's a difference between a tragic ending and an empty one. Did this game really need to brutalize its characters and its audience so much? What did that achieve, really? Would Ellie killing Abby have been a more satisfying ending? Not really. Part of the point of Abby's story was to show how revenge didn't bring her peace. It brought her guilt and inner turmoil. Vengeance would have left Ellie in a similar state. What stops Ellie from killing Abby is a particular memory with Joel. Just before the ending, we see this final flashback. It's their last conversation before his death, and their first real talk since Ellie found out the truth. Ellie expresses her anger, but also a desire to forgive Joel in time. I love the idea that forgiveness, not vengeance, is the way forward for Ellie and Abby, and really anyone holding on to hatred. That's something I would love for a game to explore. I've heard some say that forgiveness, not revenge, is what the story is really about, but I can't co-sign that reading. I wish it were true. Just because the idea is mentioned once at the very end of the game doesn't mean it's featured as a central concept. Again, because the game is coy about giving the player information, this scene doesn't land with as much impact as it should. I spent most of the time thinking Ellie and Joel had a strained relationship. Even after Ellie learns the truth and tells Joel that they're done, I didn't think that held true. I think the game purposely tries to trick you. In the prologue, there are several mentions of Ellie's relationship with Joel. These imply trouble, but not estrangement. Best I can tell, there's more than a year between this scene and this one the night before Joel's death. Ellie's friends don't seem to know that she hasn't been speaking to her father figure for over a year. This is important information. It makes this conversation so much more weighty and impactful. Ellie never got the chance to repair her relationship with Joel. They were just beginning down that long and hard road when he was killed. That context informs her whole journey, but we only get the information at the very last second. It gives players no time during the story for the implications to sink in. At the end of the game, Ellie is left alone, emotionally scarred and physically maimed. The game is really effective at making you feel this. When she tries one last time to play guitar and isn't able to because of her missing fingers, it's heartbreaking, devastating. But I couldn't escape the feeling of emptiness. I love sad endings because they often reveal something beautiful in the sorrow. Not this story. Perhaps for some, the mention of forgiveness is the faint glimmer of hope they need to make the ending work. Ellie is starting to put the past behind her, to move on, to begin the process of healing. Those ideas are there, but they're so faint in comparison to the vivid portrayal of trauma, hatred, and violence. I really needed something more concrete at the end to indicate real hope. The ending is why I'm ambivalent about this game. Rather than leaving me with something to think about, something to feel, it left me empty. I wondered not about the story or the characters, but about what the point of the whole thing was. When I stand back and examine the game, I can see the story that's being told, how it's all meant to fit together. I can see the merit of its ideas. There is a story worth telling here, but the way it's actually delivered is messy. I think I would probably appreciate some aspects of the story more on a second playthrough, knowing all the vital context from the beginning. But this is a long, unpleasant game. I have no desire to replay it anytime soon. While I would have appreciated an entirely different kind of story, I think they managed to do some inventive things with a tired premise. There are many pieces of this game that I really like. In fact, for the first third, I kept wondering what everybody's problem was. Like the first game, there are many moments of quiet serenity between the noise and terror. That's the stuff I appreciate the most. My goodwill evaporated over time, not because they killed Joel or made us play as Abby, but because the story was told in a way that often kept me at arm's length. New elements are added right up until the very end, and it's hard to care about new characters, factions, and conflicts when the last set of those have been so quickly and brutally dismissed. The Last of Us Part 2 desperately wants to impress. It wants to shock the player with its twists, reveals, and character deaths. In a lot of cases, I think those elements end up hurting the story's delivery. There's too much extreme violence too often. There's too much of the story told out of order. There are too many minor characters and plot threads. And yes, the game is longer than it needs to be. I think there's a version of this game that I love, one that's more restrained and focused, one that's less interested in shocking players and more interested in telling a straightforward, honest, emotionally challenging narrative. Part 2 is in some ways a victim of its own ambitions. Though I've critiqued it for a lot of reasons, I will commend Naughty Dog wholeheartedly for taking creative risks. We don't see that often with properties of this magnitude. And ultimately, I would much rather play a risky, ambitious, messy game than a safe, formulaic sequel. If there is a part 3 somewhere down the road, I hope that risk-taking continues. I really hope the gameplay will be shaped by the story, and not the other way around. I would love a game to truly be about healing and forgiveness, but it's difficult to imagine those themes being seriously explored with the same kind of violent gameplay. The kinds of stories that can be told with this sort of action game are limited. I love a good shooter, survival, or stealth game, and I'm not here to tell you that those genres are bad. But if a developer's ambition is to tell serious, grounded tales about relatable human beings, violence cannot and should not always be central to those games.
See, there's a sequel. Wasn't as good.